So I'm Liz. I'm with Beyond Type 1 and Beyond Type 2. And so we wanted to really talk to the community and community members about this fear behind insulin and getting insulin injections. And so I have these two awesome ladies with me. And so I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself. I'll start with Damaris because you're the first one on my screen here. So just tell us, a little bit about yourself, where you are, what type of diabetes you have, when you were diagnosed, and whether you take insulin.
So yes, my name is Damaris. Living in Houston, Texas. I was diagnosed when I was 11, close to 12. And right now I'm on Lantus and Fiasp for my short acting.
Okay.
So yeah, I have type 1 diabetes, and that was in '05.
Okay. Ooh, Team Lantis. Uh, and Rachel.
Hey, I am Rachel. I am in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I have a kind of interesting diagnosis story because I was originally diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic,
Mhm.
and later we discovered that I'm actually latent autoimmune diabetes in adults, the LATA. Um, and so when I started taking insulin, um, that was a big shift for me. But I currently take insulin with a tandem diabetes pump, the T-Slim, and I use Fiasp with that.
Okay, awesome. And it is becoming more and more common for people to be misdiagnosed as type 1 when they're actually LADA. So I'm excited to have two different perspectives kind of share their side of the story here. And so for both of you, like, what was your impression of insulin before you started using it? So like Damaris, you were pretty young when you started using that. Rachel, when were you diagnosed?
I was diagnosed with type 2 in my 20s.
Okay.
And then when I was 30, that's when we found out it was LATA. So before I started taking insulin, before we figured that out, and up until that point, the only thing I had ever heard about insulin, really, the only conversations that have happened around insulin with type 2 diabetes was that it was like a last result or a last resort, like if you're failing, like it was seen as a failure of control. Um, and it was just kind of like, you don't want to have to go on insulin because that's the last thing. That means you can't
Yeah.
control it on your own. Um, and my perspective is very different now, but it
Yeah.
was never presented like a tool that could be used. It was always presented as a, a end result of not being good enough.
Yeah. Is that kind of the same perspective in the type 1 community?
In a sense, it kind of is just not as far as like taking it, but the amount that you're taking, because there's always that resistance. And so it's like, oh, what's your insulin to carb ratio? Like that kind of, you
Wow.
know, makes you like see if you're getting any better, or if your, management is perhaps getting worse, or, other factors such as like weight gain and things like that can like impact how much insulin you're taking. For me, I didn't even know what insulin was before I was diagnosed. I mean, I'm Mexican American, so like type 2 is very common.
Mhm.
And, whenever people are older, they're like, oh, yeah, I just take this pill, But as far as like type 1 diabetes, it didn't run in my family. And my diagnosis, um, I just remember them coming with the little vials while I was in the hospital. And it's like, oh, you're going to mix these. And I'm just like, what is that?
Yeah.
But it was kind of a lot to take in just because, my parents are like immigrants. So, like, them having to understand everything and then me trying to process everything while, like, kind of translating and
Yeah.
figuring it out, as how it would impact, like, my life, you know. Because as a kid, you're like, wait. this is gonna go on forever?
Yeah.
Like, is there like a time that I can just turn it off, or like what does this mean for like the future and things like that?
Yeah, I can't imagine what it's like to be diagnosed as a kid with either type 1, 1.5, or 2. And as an adult in your 20s, it was like I was diagnosed when I was 23. And that was a big shock. Like, I have to actually care about something. And not that I didn't care about myself, but like, yeah, if I ate bad, the worst thing that happened was I got some acid reflux, or, if I drank too much, I got a hangover. But like, this really impacts the rest of your life. And that's a really big responsibility and a lot of pressure for a kid, let alone, also a 20-year-old who, has no care in the world at that age. Um, so yeah, that's really hard. And so did you fear when you were finally told, okay, this is something you're going to have to take? Because I'm sure no one ever has experience with needles or syringes or injecting anything at that point before taking insulin. So Rachel, we'll start with you. How did you handle having to take insulin? Did you take insulin injections, or have you always used the pump?
No, I started with a pen on Lantus
Okay.
and I think Novolog. And so it was when I got pregnant, and all of a sudden my fasting blood sugars, which I had been able to like control with type 2 medicines and things like that. I had normal blood sugars for fasting, but when I got pregnant, all of a sudden my fasting blood sugar were in the 200s, 300s, like they were extremely high. So my endocrinologist started me on insulin like immediately. Um, and it was just the pens, and those were really easy. That was not scary at all for me. But when I switched to maternal fetal medicine for the care, because I was pregnant, they switched me to N and R insulins, which were in vials with syringes.
Mhm.
And that something about the like just looking at the syringe was so terrifying for me. Um, I
Oh,
had always really been afraid of needles, and pen needles didn't really like count as needles in my brain, I guess, because they're just so
they're
small.
so small, yeah.
And so when I had to do syringes, it was like this whole like it's like 3 times the size. And it was just this whole mental thing. And I cried for like hours before I did my first injection. Yeah, I was a grown woman and I was terrified.
And I think that's valid. Like, a lot of people are grown adults and scared of needles. And I know for me, like personally, my mom used needle and syringe and the little vials for insulin. But like, when I first saw the like syringe, it gave me like flashbacks to like the DARE program we did in school, where like, don't do drugs. And they would show us pictures of like these syringes. And so I thought those are for drug users, those are bad. But then, I'm seeing my mom do it and use these. And I'm like, okay, so it's not the tool is bad, it's how you use the tool. And like it's all contextual and under different circumstances. But whenever someone sees like that, for a lot of people is like the only context they've ever seen a syringe in. It's like, oh, drug abuse or drug using. But like, no, we actually need this to live, we have to use this. Damaris, do you remember what you felt like when you had to start injecting?
So, funny enough, my older sister, she used to work as like an assistant in a clinic. So she was actually used to needles and like giving flu shots and little things like that. My mom is not the best when it comes to like needles or blood or anything
Mhm.
related to, like sores or anything like that. She like can easily faint or just like runs
No,
the other
it
way.
happens that way. Yeah.
But yeah, my sister, she was actually very helpful. She would give me, I think, a couple of my shots. So like the ones that would hurt the most, because there's some insulins that you feel that sting a bit more.
Uh,
I
Oh
can't
yeah.
remember which one it was, but she would be the one to actually give me my shot for that. And slowly but surely, I kind of stopped depending on her so much. Like I was still her baby sister, so she was doing it, out of a love.
Yeah.
And I'm always, going to be grateful for that. But I'm like, okay, I'm glad, I was able to slowly take the training wheels because, whenever you do see a needle, you're just like, okay, like that's good for, like your shots, or like, oh, I stepped on a needle, a tetanus shot, like here and there. But whenever you think of it as a daily kind of requirement, it's like a bit overwhelming. um, yeah, and then I did try the pump for a while, but something about just having the control of the insulin and how much you administer and like seeing it, the syringe, it kind of made me more confident and more comfortable after a while of like trying both. And that's kind of why I stick to, multiple daily injections to this day. Um, I mean, I think it's, you know, good to kind of use what technology is there. Um, but some people just prefer doing it the old school way. Yeah.
I mean, you can prefer having that way. I know it's also, a privilege to be able to have access and affordability for a lot of medical technology. So, people don't have an option to not use a pump or like to use a pump. So like they're stuck using a syringe and a vial. So how do you get over that fear? Like, I know you kind of touched on this, Damaris, of like, it's an everyday thing I have to do. Like there's really no choice there, but I can't imagine how you get over it and you just like, quote unquote, suck it up.
I think overall, it's also just kind of like the feeling of taking the insulin your body needs and then having those glucose levels be in range that makes you just feel sort of normal and just like, oh, this is my body at a good state, you know? And I think that's kind of like the motivation. It's like, oh, you know, I'm snacking in bed, but my insulin pen is a little bit further away. Like, am I gonna just keep eating or am I gonna dose because I know later on I'm gonna feel like crap if I don't?
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, like the fear of the needle itself, I didn't always think about it with Dare, but now that you pointed it out, it's like, yeah, you kind of think of needles as like being bad. And I remember one time my cartridge broke and it was leaking my insulin. So I had to go to the pharmacy and just like get a syringe because I didn't have one with me, Oops. But whenever I went to the pharmacy, they like asked for my ID, and I'm just like, yeah, like, people could be using this for other things, and they just need to like keep tabs of who's actually buying this. Um, and yeah, overall, like the fear, the needles are like smaller than what you typically imagine. So that was helpful. Um, I remember as I was getting older, I would have to get the needles like slightly longer, and that was kind of scary
Mm,
because I was like I need them bigger because I myself am like older and it needs to like pierce through more than just the top layer
yeah.
that it once was. But yeah, I think the fear. I mean, after a while, it's not just like sucking it up. It's like, okay, I'm mentally like making this decision, and like it is a needle, but it's like my treatment and it's my medication. And, at the end of the day, like, am I doing what I'm supposed to, make my health and make my life overall better?
That's a really great perspective to have. And I don't think we're ever told that perspective when we're like first diagnosed or first put on insulin. Like, okay, this is something that you get to use. You're going to feel great. It's a good thing to use. I've always heard the same perspective Rachel said, like, this is a last resort. Like you have not been able to do, you haven't been able to manage this through exercise and, nutrition. So like now we have to put you on insulin, like way to not, do what you needed to do. But if your pancreas isn't working, there's nothing that's going to help. No exercise or food or cinnamon or pill is going to make your pancreas, well, I mean, besides medication, work better. And so, Rachel, how did you overcome that fear? You said you cried, and that sounds really hard.
So The first injection that I had to do with the syringes, I don't remember ever really being like very afraid of the pen needle.
Mm.
I think the first few times I was, um, but I had when I got to insulin, I had used pen needles for like Victoza and things like that in the past. And I think when I very first used a pen with a pen needle, I had some apprehension, but like nothing like seeing the syringe. So I cried for like hours and hours and hours until my husband got home from work. And then he held my hand while I gave myself the shot.
Yeah.
And I think the motivation that knowing that like I was pregnant and like the child that was inside of me like needed me to do this um helped a lot. But I mean, like even that wasn't enough for me to be like, okay, this is fine. um but over time, it's almost like exposure therapy, I guess. Like it just becomes like once you do it so many times, it's just like, oh, this is just a thing I do. And it's just like any like new skill you would learn has a learning curve. It's almost like there's a learning curve of being not afraid of needles.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that was a big thing for me is just that, over time I had done it so many times that it was just like second nature. Especially because while I was pregnant, I was on a very aggressive insulin regimen. Um, and because I wasn't on like a long acting and a rapid acting, I was on the N and R, which were even at the time like pretty outdated.
Mm.
Um, it was a lot of injections every day.
Yeah.
So I think just like the sheer amount of them just was like, okay, I've done it X amount of times and nothing bad has happened yet. um, so I think that was a big factor for me, just like the exposure of doing it so many times.
Okay. I I can't imagine injecting into a pregnant belly. Like, was that like an extra layer of fear? Like my first thought was like, oh my gosh, is it gonna hurt the baby?
Um, no, not really, because there, is a pretty healthy layer of fat there.
Okay.
So there's that. And then also, I found that, like, just for me personally, like my arms seem to have less insulin resistance than my belly. So I was able to use my arms a lot too. And I think that may have helped.
Uh, I've never heard of anyone injecting other than like the belly area. Damaris, do you ever inject anywhere else?
Well, I inject everywhere, like
Really? I mean, that makes sense. You're not supposed to use the
my
same
arms,
site.
my thighs. Um, yeah, like my belly, I used to do quite often, and then I noticed that I was getting like bruising and stuff.
Mm.
But yeah, like I do my arms a lot, and then my thighs, and like also like my lower back, or like also like my butt, just moving it around basically. But I know some people like they're just strictly, like because they feel that resistance is lower in a certain area, they do stick to a spot. But I mean, I think just rotating, even if you have like a general area, is still good. Yeah.
How do you know if you have less resistance in an area?
So for me, like it's especially being on a constant glucose monitor, like you can see how long it takes your like some sites, you just kind of get a feel for like um you're gonna absorb the insulin better and your blood sugar is gonna come down faster if you inject in this spot versus that spot. And it's just one of those things that you just kind of get a feel for like over years, if
Okay.
that makes sense.
Yeah. I remember I talked to someone recently about you get like diabetes is like having a sixth sense. Like you learn kind of what your
Yeah.
body does. You learn like how different medications and food work. And so it really is something that you learn over time. And my last question is like for anyone who's newly diagnosed, like just got told they need to do insulin injections for, regardless if it's type 1 or type 1.5 or 2, what advice would you have for that person? Whoever wants to go first. Not me. Okay,
I can
Rachel.
go. I can go. I mean, like, I would say, like, the biggest thing for someone who's just been diagnosed is, regardless of what type they have, explaining to them that, like, insulin is just a tool. It's not like having to use insulin or not use insulin is not like a reflection on your morality or whether or not you're a good or bad person. It's just another tool that's available to us. And thank God it is, because
Yeah.
it's amazing. And that, you know, like, and I will say this to so many people, even like so many people with gestational diabetes talk about like they failed the glucose tolerance test instead of saying like or they were diagnosed. And I'm like, you didn't fail anything. Like your body does not respond to sugar the way that it would be better for you if it did. But like I would just like my biggest piece of advice to anyone who's starting insulin is that it's gonna be scary and it's gonna suck, but then it's gonna get better. And that also it's just a tool and it's not like a failure if you're on insulin.
Awesome. Damaris?
Yeah, I think, no matter what they're diagnosed with, I think it's important to realize like it's my human body needing something, and I shouldn't feel any sort of shame for that because I mean everybody else without diabetes is doing it just fine. So I mean it's just an extra task that has to be done to, maintain good blood sugars. If you're like newly diagnosed, I would say, maybe try. I remember there were a few friends that told me that whenever they were first meeting the diabetes educator, they would practice on like fruit and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it kind of reminds me of like a tattooer, but yeah, it
Yeah.
kind of makes sense, like, oh yeah, it's piercing a pore and it's your skin just so that you can sort of get a feel for like, oh, how much to push down or like how it feels physically in your hand. Um, I mean, and if you absolutely like can't, try your best to do a pump. Obviously, it's not always the easiest thing with accessibility and affordability, but as long as you're getting your insulin and what you need um, for your management some way or another, that's really what matters. Yeah.
I remember when I first started using insulin, I was surprised at two things. One, it burns on certain sides. Like I was not expecting it to burn. And I remember freaking out and, messaging my doctor and saying, am I allergic to this? What's going on? I'm not allergic to insulin. But she explained that it's just because of the pH difference in, the insulin. And so wasn't expecting that. But also, if you don't inject in the right site, it'll inject right under the skin. And so you'll get like a bubble. And so you have to know like what good sites look like or feel like. So, more fatty areas, more fatty tissue is better. But like, how would you describe getting an insulin injection?
I guess I would say it feels like a pinch, especially with how thin, needles are nowadays. Depending on the type of insulin, you will feel more of a burn than others. Um, but yeah, I mean, the good thing about the burn is that it's going in, and then
That is true. Yeah.
the bad thing about it is obviously, the little
Burn.
pain, extra pain and burn that you feel. But I guess I don't know, it kind of reminds me sort of a bee sting, but like less intense.
Mm.
Yeah. And then, it's done with faster than like an actual,
Yeah.
yeah.
Rachel?
Like, so for me, I've only ever experienced burning with cold insulin
Mm.
or like certain brands, particularly like the new one, Lumjev. Um, Lumjev burns no matter where I put it or like what temperature it is. It just is going to burn no matter what. So I don't use that one. Um,
Yeah.
but like, but I know other people who Lumjev doesn't burn and Fiasp does, but Fiasp doesn't burn for me at all. So I think that, you know, just like everything else with diabetes, it's going to be different for each person. But for me, like a standard injection, I don't even know if I would consider it like as bad as getting a pinch. Like it's just, I don't know. It's so commonplace for me at this point that it's just like it just doesn't really feel like anything, if that makes sense.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, like your body does, you know, grow some sort of like what would be
Tolerance.
tolerance to it. But I mean, there might be those times where you hit a vein, you know, and
Oh
things
yeah.
and those aren't always the best. But yeah, it's like a live and learn process. So you know to avoid that or kind of what to look for and searching for those fatty spots. Yeah, to help it, you know, feel less.
Yeah, I've noticed if I inject by accident on like a stretch mark, it's always way more painful than if I avoid stretch marks. So I've learned that lesson. But awesome. Well, thank you both